Behind the monstrous facade of the Third Reich lurked a surprisingly hilarious truth. These guys really didn't like each other. So buckle up, folks, because we're about to take a comedic deep dive into the dysfunctional family that was the Nazi leadership. The Nazi inner circle was more like a viper pit, filled with venomous personalities vying for power. Imagine a reality show where the contestants are all competing to be the biggest jerk, and the prize is control of a totalitarian regime. And at the center of this circus of crazy was, of course, the ringmaster himself, Adolf Hitler. The early days of the Nazi Party were a chaotic mess, like a garage band trying to find their sound. One of the earliest rivalries was between Hitler and Ernst Röhm, leader of the SA, the Nazi Party's paramilitary wing. Hitler, being the master manipulator that he was, started playing both sides. Hitler and Röhm had a complex relationship, a bromance gone horribly, horribly wrong. Röhm openly boasted about his plans for the SA and his disdain for the traditional military. Hitler accused Röhm of plotting a coup, a conspiracy to overthrow the government. The Night of the Long Knives was a brutal display of political violence. Hitler ordered the arrest and execution of Röhm and dozens of other SA leaders. It was a chilling reminder of the dangers of absolute power. Himmler, the head of the SS, was a strange bird obsessed with the occult and racial purity. Göring, on the other hand, was a flamboyant peacock who loved fine food and art. Their rivalry was about power, influence, and access to Hitler's ear. Himmler was thin and wiry, like a nervous ferret, while Göring enjoyed his meals. Their contrasting physiques became a symbol of their rivalry. It was a battle of the bulging waistlines versus the tightly cinched belts. The rivalry between Himmler and Göring extended to the dining table. Göring hosted lavish banquets, while Himmler preferred simple, bland meals. Their culinary clashes were a microcosm of their larger power struggle. Hitler, despite being a genocidal maniac, was surprisingly particular about his home decor. His residences were testaments to his unique aesthetic sensibilities. Unfortunately for him, his vision was about as aesthetically pleasing as a dumpster fire. Eva Braun, Hitler's long-suffering mistress, had her own ideas about interior design. She preferred a more modern, streamlined aesthetic, a stark contrast to Hitler's penchant for fussy traditionalism. Think clean lines, minimalist furniture, and a distinct lack of gold tassels. It was a style that could best be described as Bauhaus chic, a far cry from the dictator's preferred decor. Her attempts to modernize Hitler's residences were met with varying degrees of success. She managed to introduce some contemporary elements, like sleek armchairs and minimalist lamps, but she was never able to completely overcome Hitler's love of chintz and gilt. It was a constant tug-of-war between her modern sensibilities and his traditional tastes, a design battle fought on the domestic front. Their disagreements over interior design were a source of constant amusement for their inner circle. Hitler would grumble about Eva's modernist nonsense, while Eva would roll her eyes at his old-fashioned clutter. It was a domestic comedy played out against the backdrop of a world war, a reminder that even genocidal maniacs have to deal with relationship issues. Eva's design interventions were not just about aesthetics, however. They were also a reflection of her own desire for control and influence. She may have been Hitler's mistress, but she was also a woman with her own opinions and tastes. And she wasn't afraid to express them, even if it meant challenging the Führer himself. It was a small act of rebellion, a subtle way of asserting her own identity in a world dominated by a tyrannical madman. All right, folks, let's dive into the architectural ambitions of Albert Speer, Hitler's favorite architect who had some truly grand visions for the future of Germany. Picture this: monumental buildings, vast plazas, and imposing structures that would reflect the glory of the Third Reich. We're talking neoclassical architecture on steroids, a style best described as dictator grandiose. Speer dreamed of transforming Berlin into a world capital, a city that would inspire both awe and fear in equal measure. Now, Hitler, on the other hand, had his own, shall we say, unique ideas about architecture. The man had a thing for kitsch, clutter, and anything that stroked his own supposed artistic genius. He often meddled with Speer's designs, adding his personal touches: oversized eagles, ornate columns, and enough swastikas to make a stadium full of neo-Nazis blush. It was truly a clash of architectural titans, a battle between Speer's grandiose vision and Hitler's, well, questionable taste. Their architectural disagreements were a source of endless frustration for Speer. He'd try to explain the principles of good design, the importance of proportion and balance, but Hitler would just wave him off and insist on more gold trim. It was like trying to teach a pig to sing. It wastes your time and annoys the pig. Despite their differences, both Speer and Hitler shared a common goal: to create monumental architecture that reflected the power and glory of the Third Reich. They just had wildly different ideas about what that architecture should look like. Speer saw a city of imposing grandeur, while Hitler envisioned a city designed by a particularly enthusiastic hoarder. It was a clash of visions, a battle between good taste and bad taste, all playing out against the backdrop of a world war. In its own strange way, it was a testament to the enduring power of human folly. Now, let's talk about the Nazi regime, which, despite its initial successes, was ultimately a dysfunctional mess. The constant infighting, backstabbing, and power struggles among the leadership created an atmosphere of paranoia and distrust. It was like a reality show where the contestants are all trying to vote each other off the island, except the island is Germany and the prize is absolute power. And let's be honest, the casting director for this particular reality show had a real eye for crazy. This internal chaos inevitably impacted the regime's ability to function effectively. Decisions were delayed, resources were misallocated, and strategic blunders were commonplace. It was like a group project where everyone is trying to take credit for the good ideas and blame each other for the bad ones. Except instead of a bad grade, the consequence was, a world war. The dysfunction wasn't limited to the top brass. Oh no, it trickled down through the ranks, creating a culture of fear and incompetence. Imagine a company where the CEO is a narcissistic sociopath. The managers are all vying for his favor, and the employees are terrified of making a mistake. It's not exactly a recipe for success, is it? And in the case of the Nazi regime, the lack of success had some pretty dire consequences for, well, everyone. The infighting among the Nazi leaders wasn't just a source of amusement for historians. It was a key factor in the regime's ultimate downfall. They were so busy fighting amongst themselves that they lost sight of the bigger picture. They were like a group of kids playing with matches, too caught up in their own little game to notice that they were setting the house on fire. So, Section 2, Paranoia and Parades. Hitler, as we've established, was a paranoid individual. He saw enemies everywhere, even within his own inner circle. Trust was a rare commodity for him. He trusted no one, not even his closest confidants. It was like living in a house made of mirrors where every reflection seems like a potential assassin. And let's be honest, when you're a genocidal dictator, you probably have a few legitimate reasons to be paranoid. This paranoia, oh boy, it fueled the infighting among his underlings. They were constantly trying to prove their loyalty, outmaneuver their rivals, and avoid becoming the next target of the Führer's wrath. It was like a game of musical chairs, where the last one standing gets a one-way ticket to a concentration camp. Not exactly a game you want to win. The constant parades and rallies, while impressive displays of propaganda, also served to mask the underlying dysfunction. They created a facade of unity and strength, while behind the scenes, the Nazi leadership was tearing itself apart. It was like a family Thanksgiving dinner where everyone pretends to be happy, while secretly plotting to steal each other's inheritance. The paranoia and the parades were two sides of the same coin. They were both symptoms of the deep-seated insecurity and instability that plagued the Nazi regime. They were a reflection of the fact that the Third Reich, despite its outward appearance of power, was built on a foundation of fear, lies, and delusion. Moving on to Section 3, from blitzkrieg to bumbling. The early successes of the Nazi military, those blitzkrieg campaigns that swept across Europe, were due in part to the element of surprise and the unpreparedness of their opponents. But as the war dragged on, the cracks in the Nazi war machine began to show. The infighting among the leadership, the paranoia, and the incompetence all took their toll. It was like a car that starts off fast, but quickly runs out of gas and starts sputtering down the highway. The strategic decisions made by the Nazi leadership were often influenced by personal rivalries and political maneuvering, rather than sound military strategy. Imagine a football team where the coach is choosing plays based on which players he likes, rather than what will actually work. It's not exactly a recipe for a Super Bowl victory, is it? The lack of coordination and communication between different branches of the military, a direct result of the infighting, led to costly mistakes and missed opportunities. It was like a symphony orchestra where the musicians are all playing different tunes, completely out of sync with each other. It's not exactly a recipe for a standing ovation, is it? As the war progressed, the Nazi regime's bumbling became increasingly apparent. They were like a group of clowns trying to juggle chainsaws, eventually dropping them all and setting the circus tent on fire. And unfortunately, the circus tent in this case was the entire world. The dysfunction that had plagued the Nazi leadership from the beginning ultimately contributed to their downfall. They were their own worst enemies, and their internal conflicts paved the way for their eventual defeat. Now, Section 1. The Farce of the Führer. Looking back at the inner workings of the Nazi regime, it's hard not to be struck by the sheer absurdity of it all. These were the men who orchestrated one of the most horrific events in human history. Yet their interactions often resembled a poorly written sitcom. Imagine a group of clowns trying to run a country, except the clowns are all armed with nuclear weapons and a burning hatred for anyone who doesn't look like them. It's a terrifying thought, but also, in a strange way, kind of hilarious. The constant infighting, the backstabbing, the petty squabbles, it all seems so incredibly trivial in the face of the atrocities they committed. It's like watching a group of toddlers fighting over a toy while the house is burning down around them. They were so consumed by their own egos and ambitions that they lost sight of the bigger picture, the catastrophic consequences of their actions. It's a testament to the human capacity for self-delusion, the ability to ignore the obvious even when it's staring you in the face. The irony, of course, is that their dysfunction ultimately contributed to their downfall. They were so busy fighting amongst themselves that they failed to see the writing on the wall, the inevitable consequences of their own hubris. They were like a group of rats gnawing at the ropes of their own sinking ship, completely oblivious to the fact that they were all going down together. It's a darkly comedic image, a fitting end to a regime built on lies, hatred, and delusion. The farce of the Führer and his cronies is a reminder that even the most evil regimes are susceptible to human folly. They may have been monsters, but they were also human, with all the flaws and weaknesses that entails. And in the end, it was their own human failings that brought them down. Finally, Section 2, A Legacy of Laughter and Horror. The legacy of the Nazi regime is a complex one, a mix of horror and, dare I say, a touch of dark humor. We can't forget the atrocities they committed, the millions of lives they destroyed, but we can also acknowledge the absurdity of their inner workings, the farcical nature of their power struggles. It's a delicate balance, to be sure, but it's an important one. We can learn from the past, even the darkly comedic parts of it. After all, history is full of cautionary tales, and sometimes those tales are so absurd that they're almost funny. The Nazi leaders were not just monsters. They were also clowns, buffoons, and petty tyrants. They were driven by greed, ambition, and a toxic cocktail of ideological fanaticism. And they were, in their own strange way, kind of hilarious. It's like watching a train wreck in slow motion, except the train is full of Nazis, and the wreckage is, well, pretty much everything. It's a horrifying spectacle, but it's also, in a darkly comedic way, kind of fascinating. Their legacy is not just one of destruction and despair, it's also a legacy of laughter, albeit laughter tinged with a healthy dose of horror. We can laugh at their absurdity, their incompetence, and their sheer stupidity, but we must never forget the real-world consequences of their actions, the unimaginable suffering they inflicted on millions of people. It's a difficult balance to strike, but it's an essential one. The Nazis may have been a historical tragedy, but they were also, in a strange way, a historical comedy. And like all good comedies, they offer a valuable lesson. Don't be a Nazi. It's a simple message, but it's one that bears repeating. Because the world has seen enough Nazi clowns, and it's time for the show to end.